Welcome to the Overlanding Creation channel. I'm Steven, and today we're teaming up with Torch Off-Road to bring an installation video for their 3-inch lift kit on the second generation Toyota Tundras. This lift kit includes 3-inch strut top spacers for your front, as well as differential drop spacers. It includes rear leaf springs, as well as shims to correct the drive angle of your rear axle. It also includes your installation components such as bolts, washers, nuts, and the install was fairly straightforward. It wasn't that difficult. Overall, I think it's something you guys can do at home with basic hand tools. I've been very pleased with the Torch products. I think you guys will be as well. Go to torchoffroad.com to check out their various lift kits as well as other parts for trucks and SUVs. And make sure you use discount code OVERLAND10 for a 10% discount on Torch branded products. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the install video. Okay, so starting here with the front of the vehicle, we're going to remove both front wheels. Again, as you can see, I'm using a lift, but this is something that could be done at home with a jack and a few jack stands. That would be fine. I also use some air tools or some battery tools in here as well, which made it a little easier for me, but it's not necessary. You can just use basic hand tools. Most of these things aren't too tight, so you can break them free by hand. But we're going to go ahead and start by disconnecting the steering knuckle from the upper control arm. As you can see, they use a castle nut from the factory, and it has a pin that goes through it. That pin just prevents that castle nut from backing out. So I'm going to go ahead and use some needle nose pliers to take that pin out, and then once that's removed, we can go ahead and we can remove that upper castle nut. You want to make sure you hang on to those pins. You don't want to lose those because we will be using those again. Once that's removed, we can go ahead and we can get this upper control arm castle nut off. You do want to be careful once that nut is out and you have that broke free. You don't want to let that you don't want to let that steering knuckle hang down because there is your brake line as well as some other wires there. So you'll see here in a minute what I do with that. But I'm just going to go ahead and grab a hammer and tap that free. Usually it only takes a few solid hits with a good hammer to break that free. You do want to be careful though. Make sure you're only hitting the steering knuckle and not the upper control arm. You could damage the upper ball joint, the rubber part of that. So you just want to be careful. But usually a few solid hits and then I'll break free. Next, I'm grabbing a 10mm socket and a little ratchet. I'm going to go ahead and take the bracket free. There's a little bracket that holds the brake caliper hose. It connects the brake caliper hose to the upper control arm, and I'm just going to go ahead and disconnect that. What that's going to do is it's going to give some extra play in that hose. So as you can see, I'm just checking all the lines here and the hoses, making sure nothing's carrying the weight of that steering knuckle because we don't want to damage anything there. If it is pulling on that, you can always put a little hanger on there, which I do in a bit. So now I got a 21mm socket as well as a wrench, and I'm taking the bolt out that goes through the lower part of the front strut. It goes through the lower control arm and through the bottom of that front strut. So once I had that broke free, you're going to need to tap that bolt out. I just grab a small hammer, and I usually use a little punch as well. And I'll just give that a few taps, and you can knock that bolt out. There shouldn't be too much pressure on it since we do have the upper control arm disconnected. So just a few solid hits. We'll get that bolt tapped out. We can remove that. Usually as a rule of thumb, I just put the nut back on the bolt so I keep everything in one place, and that way we don't lose anything. Now we got one more castle nut, connects the outer tie rod end to the steering knuckle. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take that pin out. Again, you want to be careful bending that straight. You don't want to damage that because, like I said, we are going to reuse those pins when we put it back together again. But you want to take that pin out, and once that's out, we can take the castle nut off that connects the outer tie rod end of your steering rack and pinion to your steering knuckle. And you can see here, once again, I'm using an air tool, but none of these were that tight, so you could easily do it by hand as well. Once we had that castle nut removed, I'm going to go ahead and place that with the rest of the stuff. You want to keep that all in one place. And again, this is the same concept. Make sure you hit the steering knuckle. Check those threads out. You don't want to hit the threads. You want to make sure they're all in good shape. And you want to make sure you hit that steering knuckle and not the tie rod itself. As you can see there, I do have a hanger. Nothing was pulling too hard. but I did place a hanger there just to make sure that it was holding the weight. Now we have 4 nuts that mount the top of your front strut to the upper strut mount. And I'm going to use a 14mm socket to remove those nuts. Now you'll see what I do here is I remove 3 of them, but I leave 1 in place. And the reason for that is because we don't want the strut falling out when we remove it from the lower control arm. So I take 2 nuts off the front here. I did find that the socket worked great for the outer nuts, but the ones in the back were a little tricky to get with the socket. So instead, as you can see here, I just use a wrench and I can easily access those 2 nuts in the back. So I remove 1 of the rears, so we have 3 of them out, and I still have 1 in there, just holding that strut in place. So again, it doesn't fall when we pop it out of the lower control arm. Once those 3 are removed, all that's left to disconnect is just your sway bar link. As you can see here, I'm just going to go ahead and pull the bolt for the sway bar link out. That just comes out. There's no nut or anything. That's all part of the lower control arm. So once we get that bolt out, I'm just going to go ahead and grab a pry bar. And you don't have to apply too much pressure, just a little pressure, that pops right out. And then you can see that's dangling there. So now I'm just going to take that last nut off the top, and I'll be able to very easily pull that front strut out there, as you can see. So now we're going to go ahead and put that spacer on. Now in this case, I was replacing the front strut, so I had to remove the strut mount, as you can see here. But the process is still the same. If you're not replacing the strut, you can just pop that spacer right on the top of that strut mount, even with it completely assembled. So the process is the same. I just put the nuts on, and I just tighten them hand tight. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my ratchet and a 14mm socket, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to snug them up by hand. Now, as you can see here, the strut is reassembled, but again, if you're not replacing the strut, that's no problem. You can just simply pop that spacer onto the top of your strut using those existing studs. Put the factory nuts back on, and you're going to go ahead and you're going to snug them down by hand. And then once they're tightened by hand, I go ahead and I get my torque wrench and I torque them all down to spec. I did look up the Toyota factory torque specs, and it called for 45 Newton meters of torque for those 4 upper strut mount nuts. What I found was easy here is I just use a screwdriver to hold the bottom of the strut while I torque them down. It's not a ton of pressure, so it's pretty easy to do. And I just go around and I torque all 4 of these nuts to, again, 45 Newton meters. You want to make sure you don't over torque these, because obviously that could lead to some issues like stripping the threads or even maybe cracking that spacer. So 45 Newton meters is what the factory calls for, so that's what I went with. You could also apply a tiny bit of maybe some medium strength Loctite if you want as well. That wouldn't hurt anything. Now once I have all 4 of these nuts torqued to spec, there is a small dot on the top of the spacer that Torch put on there, which was really good. And what that dot indicates is the direction. You want that to be facing towards you. So I'll show you here that in a second when I go ahead and put it on. Torch also includes all of the installation hardware, which is really nice. There's going to be 4 bolts that mount the top of the strut to the vehicle, and they come with locking washers as well as flat washers. So you want to make sure you got both of those washers placed on each bolt. And then usually what I'll do is once I have all those washers on the bolts, I'll just go ahead and do a test fit, make sure it fits nice and smooth, which it does, obviously. Everything fit up very nicely there. Now that that's done, we can go ahead and we can install that strut. I do like to clean the surfaces. I just clean the surface of the frame there where it mounts up. Now, as you can see here, here's the little dot I was telling you about. There's a little dot in the surface there. You want to make sure that that's facing you, and that'll make sure that that strut is properly aligned. So that's going to face outwards while you're installing that. And I just hold that up with one hand and then stick a bolt in there by hand. And then the rest of the installation is just the reversed order of the removal. Moving on to these front diff spacers. These were super easy. You just remove the factory bolts, and we're going to replace those with the extended bolts that Torch supplies. And we're going to stick the black spacers in between the differential carrier and the front subframe. So as you can see there, and this is they've already been installed here. So you're just going to stick that spacer in between there, and that's it. That finishes up the installation for the front of the vehicle. Now moving on to the rear. All right, guys, so I'm going to go over the install of the rear part of this lift kit. Thankfully, it's very simple. Torch does a great job at supplying everything you need to do the lift. And even though the front isn't overly difficult, the rear is even simpler yet. So I'm just going to go over the steps real quick. It's going to be real easy. The kit includes your extended heavy-duty U-bolts. It includes your add-a-leaf, and it also includes your shim here. What's great about this kit is it includes that shim, which corrects the angle on your rear axle, your rear differential here. It brings your drive shaft at the correct angle into the rear differential so you don't have any shuddering or vibrations. And I can attest to that. I've had the truck out on the road. It drives super smooth, no issues from the rear end whatsoever. So Torch did a great job with that. All right, so what you're gonna do in the install here is you wanna go ahead and you wanna put some C-clamps on the rear leaf pack. I put them out here. You don't wanna have the C-clamp over top this base plate because that's gonna be separate. So you wanna have a C-clamp on either side of your leaf pack to hold them together. You take the factory U-bolts free, you drop this plate out, you take the U-bolts completely off. You wanna make sure that you have a jack. In my case, since the truck was on a lift, I did a screw jack or a pull jack underneath the rear axle here, and I lowered it down. So once you got the rear axle dropped and free, this base plate is going to be accessible. Now keep in mind on second gen Tundras, you do have a little dowel rod that goes through here that holds the base plate onto the main pack. That dowel rod is just pressed in, so it's pretty easy to pop out. I just used a little punch with a hammer, and I was able to punch it out pretty easily and free up this base plate. There also is a bolt and nut that holds the main pack together. You just simply take the nut off and that comes out as well. So now once that's all free, you're gonna go ahead and you're gonna add your shim to the bottom of the pack that goes right here on top of the rear axle here. And you do have a heavy duty screw and nut that Torch provides. It goes all the way through your shim in the bottom, it goes through your base plate, and it's gonna go all the way through your leaves to the top, and there's gonna be a nut on top there. So you wanna go shim, base plate, you want to put your add-a-leaf in the middle there. Your screw is going to go all the way to the top, and you're going to put the nut down on top. Now once you have the nut on, what I recommend doing is moving your C-clamps to the complete assembly. Now initially you had them just over the leaf pack, now we're going to move them to the complete assembly, and you're going to pinch everything together. So you want to fully compress that add-a-leaf till everything's nice and closed down here. Once that's done, you can go ahead and you can tighten your nut down and make sure this is tightened up. Keep in mind that you're going to have about an inch or two of screw or a bolt left over once that nut's tightened down. And what I did is I just went ahead and cut that off just right above where that nut sits, and that's going to allow your bump stop to sit in place there. So once you have that tightened down, you cut off that excess, the bump stop goes on there. You're going to put your heavy duty U-bolts that Torch provides. These are really good quality, really heavy duty U-bolts, which I really like. I think Torch did a good job. I'm going with something really heavy duty. You're going to want something pretty beefy, and they definitely provide that. Once those U-bolts are on, there's a little guide up top here. So you can see they sit right in that channel, and then you're going to put your base plate on, and you're going to start putting your nuts in. Now Torch does provide all new nuts and washers, which is great. And you want to tighten these down in either a circular pattern or a cross pattern to make sure that base plate is tightened evenly. Once those are all tightened and torqued down, you can go ahead and take those C-clamps off, and the rear add-a-leaf lift kit is going to be completely installed. Now this does add about 2.5 inches to the overall vehicle. It's a 3-inch lift kit, but because of the rake of the vehicle going about 2 to 2.5 inches in the rear, it's going to do a great job at leveling it out. I think the truck looks pretty well leveled, which I like. I prefer that look as opposed to having a forward rake, which Toyota does from the factory. All right, guys, well, there you go. It's like I said, it's a pretty easy install in the rear. If you guys have any questions, please leave comments down below, and I'll make sure to jump on here and answer those questions for you. Overall, I was very pleased with the lift kit. Again, I apologize I wasn't able to get a live install of the rear due to some camera issues. But again, thankfully I was able to get the front for you guys, which was the more difficult part, and the rear is a pretty easy process. Hope to help you guys out. Again, the front install went pretty smoothly as well. As you guys saw, that whole process was pretty easy. Overall, I was very pleased with the install of the lift kit. Torch supplied everything that I needed. I really appreciate them working with me on this job. Super happy with the company, super happy with the parts, quality, durability, everything seems to be built really well. Again, I have had the truck out on the highway for some miles and had no complaints so far. The ride's very smooth. You know, little things like those shims in the rear make a big difference as far as the overall ride quality. Well, there you have it, guys. I hope this video has been helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I'd love to see your comments down below. And make sure you subscribe to the channel and check out future videos like my trip to Uwharrie National Forest, where I test out the new lift kit on some pretty difficult trails. I'll catch you later.